Hi, so I wanted to make a video covering all things MIDI on the Octatrack and quickly realized that's way too much to pack into one video. So this one's going to be more of a video manual covering all the parameters in the menus of the MIDI mode of the Octatrack. So if you're curious about one particular parameter, there's a good chance you'll find the answer to your question in this video. If you're more on the lookout for inspiration for what to do with the MIDI mode of the Octatrack, I've got some other videos focusing more on the music making than on what the different knobs and buttons do. So those might be worth checking out. But for now, let's dive into the MIDI menus of the Octatrack. So the first thing you're going to want to do, I guess, is connect the Octatrack with some external instrument. I've got the Microfreak right here to show you how all of this works. I've got it connected right now just with the MIDI out of the Octatrack going into the MIDI in of the Microfreak, and then the audio out of the Microfreak is going back into the Octatrack so I can hear it. Now what I have to do here to actually be able to hear it is set up a through track and set the input here to A. Add a trigger. By default, this should be set to infinity. So now I can hear the audio of the Microfreak. Let's have a look at this MIDI button on the top left here. That's how you get to the MIDI sequencer. And you press the button when it's lit. This means you're in MIDI mode now, and now the buttons T1 to T8 represent 8 MIDI tracks. You can select the tracks by just pushing one of those buttons, and then on the screen you can always see what MIDI channel it is assigned to. Right now there's a little X, which means it's not assigned to any MIDI channel, and then below that, just like in the audio section, you can see whether the track is playing or not. So now I'm going to select the appropriate MIDI channel for the Microfreak. I'm going to check here real quick. Global MIDI menu input channel. It says here input channel 6. So I'm going to set this to channel 6 as well. You do this by double tapping this source button. This brings you to the MIDI notes setup, and here you can see you can choose a channel. Now, while the writing above the number is still inversed, you haven't selected the channel yet. You have to confirm your selection, and you do this by either pressing this encoder. Now the writing is not inversed anymore and we've selected channel 6, or by pressing yes, which I prefer, because sometimes when I'm pushing a encoder, I turn it at the same time and I'm selecting the wrong value. So this yes button for me works a bit better. Then let's go back out of this MIDI note setup menu, and then we have the regular note menu. You can see the menus for in the MIDI section are labeled below the buttons for the menus of the audio section, and then you can start sequencing. You do this the same way pretty much you would on an audio track. I can press the record button here to get into step recording mode, and then I can enter some tricks, play this back. And we can hear the Microfreak playing. And then let's have a look at this note menu right here. The first parameter here is note. This lets you choose the note you want the sequencer to play. Now, most of the time you don't want the sequence with just one note. So you can lock parameters to different tracks. You do this by holding down a track. For example, the second one here, I'm going to assign a different note to an A. So now this is locked to an A. All the other ones are always going to play the note that's selected up here. So if I change this to a G, we're going to hear a whole lot of G's, and this one A. That's how you do basic MIDI sequencing on the Octatrack. Then we have a couple more parameters here. The second one is velocity. This usually is associated with volume, but it can be assigned to other things depending on what synth you have hooked up. Here on the Microfreak, I think the only thing it can do is volume, and I have to turn this on by going to this modulations menu, and then there's the option for velocity amp mod. Turn this up, and now changing the velocity here will decrease or increase the volume of the sound. Same as with the notes, I can parameter lock different velocity values to individual trigs. So this is going to be a loud one, this very quiet, and all the ones that do not have a velocity value locked to them are going to have the value this is set to. So maybe 100. This is how velocity works. Then there's a length setting, pretty self-explanatory, adjusts the length of a note. I'm going to set this to all sustain so it's easy to hear what's happening. This is a 16th note. I can make them really short to the point where we're not really able to hear them anymore, or longer. Once this length value is longer than the maximum distance between any two triggers here, there's not going to be a difference anymore. Then there's the possibility to add additional notes, note 2, 3, and 4. Those are always going to be in relation to note 1 that you choose right here. And you can dial in an offset in semitones here. So for example, +3 is going to give us a minor third. Going to turn on paraphonic here, so this guy can actually play multiple notes at a time. And now you can hear, even though it says A sharp here, when we get to this trigger 4, we're not hearing an A sharp, but instead a minor third above the A, so a C. Same thing happens if I were to change this note setting right here for all the other trigs. Set it to C, for example. This guy changes along with it. Then there's note 3 and 4, which let you add a couple more notes. So I'm going to do this right here, and maybe a 5th and a minor 7th for a minor 7th chord. Let's talk about those program change options in the MIDI note setup as well real quick. You can assign a program change that's being sent to your external synth in here, for example, program number 19. Same as with the channel, when it's inversed, the routing, it's not selected yet. I have to press yes or push the encoder. And now I've selected preset 19. Now you can see on the Microfreak, it's selected preset 20. This is because some synths start with 0 as the first preset and some with 1. Then you can add bank and sub-bank numbers. If you want to turn this off, you go all the way to the right on the encoder and then confirm again, and it's set to off. So that's it for the note menu. So let's move on to the ARP menu. We can turn on the ARP by changing this mode setting to anything other than off. There's a couple of different options here. The first one's true, which will play back the notes that you have in the sequencer or that you're playing on a MIDI keyboard that's going into the Octatrack in the order they were played, or in this order they're set up here. So note 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe get rid of those tricks so you have just the one here. Now we only hear one note because the length here is set to 1/16th note. I'm going to set this to infinity for now, so the ARP just keeps playing. I'm going to increase the tempo a bit. So here's your ARP. Then there's the mode up, which plays the note in ascending order, down in descending order, cycle, meaning up and down. Then there's shuffle. Shuffle means it's gonna shuffle the notes within one octave. For this to make a little bit more sense, we maybe have to increase the octave range, which is down here in the middle. You can choose up to 8 octaves that your ARP can span across. I'm gonna set this to 3 maybe for now. So let's have a listen with the mode set back to true maybe. So you get an idea of what this is doing. And when we go to shuffle, pay attention to how the order of the octaves is still going to be the same, lowest, middle, top octave, but within every octave, the note's going to be in a random order. And then there's the last setting, which is random. Here, the order of the notes is going to be completely random. Then there's a speed setting, which lets me speed up the ARP or make it slower. The way in which this is done is a bit odd because it's a multiplier, and a larger value leads to a slower ARP, a smaller value to a faster ARP. The smallest possible value, which, if my math is correct, is a 64th triplet, just gets multiplied. So we'd have a 64th triplet right here, times 3 would be a 32nd note. I'm going to set this back to up maybe. And then double this gives us a 16th note. Double it again, 8th note, and so on. But it leads to some really odd values in between. So that's the speed. And then on the bottom right, there's a note length for the note values within the arpeggio. So the note length on the note setup menu is going to determine how long the ARP is going to keep playing after it first gets triggered. So maybe if I set this to something lower again and speed it up again, you can hear this. It stops just around here. And the note length within the ARP is going to determine how long every note of the ARP is going to be. From short to long. Again here, once the note length here is longer than the distance between the notes of the arpeggio, it's not going to make a difference anymore. Then let's go back to the beginning here. There's a transpose setting which lets you transpose the entire ARP. What's cool about this one is that it also works when the ARP is not on, the mode set to off. This will still transpose whatever I dialed here into my sequence. So let's have a listen to this. This is in semitones, and you can go from -64 to +63, so quite a large range here. Then lastly, I'm going to get rid of those tricks again. There's this legato mode. For this to have an effect, you have to have a external instrument that somehow can deal with the legato stuff. Here in the modulation section of the Microfreak, there's this envelope legato option, and I can turn this on. And what this means is the envelope is only going to trigger when there's a gap in between notes. So as long as I keep holding any note down, I'm not going to hear this filter envelope in this case. And when I release all the keys, press a new one, we're going to hear the envelope being triggered. What the Octatrack lets me do here when I'm playing a sequence, for example, an ARP here again, turn this back on. This legato mode lets me do the same thing when I turn this off. There's always going to be a little gap in between every note, and when legato is on, they will overlap, given that their length is long enough that they should overlap. So like this, the envelope gets triggered once when the ARP is triggered, and with legato off, every note within the ARP is triggering the envelope. Now here, if the length of this trigger were long enough for it to overlap with the next trigger, so anything longer than 1 bar, and legato on, like this, we would hear the envelope being triggered just the one time when I start the sequencer. And then never again. So this is everything on this page of the ARP menu. When you double tap the aim button, you get to this MIDI ARP setup menu, which is also kind of a cool thing. What this does is it adds offsets to the notes of the arpeggio. And it's got its own little sequence right here. You can see these greenly lit buttons down here, those represent the steps of the sequence, and I can dial in an offset in semitones by holding down any one of these, and then with this level encoder adjusting this. So for example, when I set this to 12, this third step of the ARP is always going to be 1 octave higher than the note it would otherwise play. You can see this loops around. If the ARP keeps playing for a longer time than this sequence would last. I can also adjust the length of this from 1 to 16 steps. So I could go rather short with 3 steps. So there would be kind of a 3 pattern recognizable, with this third note always being 1 octave higher, or maybe if I go 2 octaves higher, it'd be even more noticeable. For kind of a polyrhythm thing. This bottom right encoder lets you dial in a scale for quantization, because things can get really messy, especially when you have multiple notes on a trigger, a chord that's being arpeggiated, and then offset those. So I could set this to the key of C major, for example. The options here are just minor and major for all of the notes. I can just randomly do stuff, and it's always going to be part of a C major scale. Yeah. With the quantization off, it would sound like this, which is a bit messier than this. This also works without the ARP being on and without this offset menu. So I'm going to clear this page right here, set this back to C major, and show you what I mean. I'm going to turn the ARP off as well and go back to the note menu. Let me get rid of those to demonstrate what this is actually doing. I've got a C, which gives you a C, and then the C sharp is also going to give you a C. So the quantizer corrects the note to the nearest note below the one you're dialing in, and the D is within the C major scale. You're going to get that. D sharp is going to give you D as well, and so on, which is very neat. This would also allow you to have different chords in a sequence and have them all be diatonic. So for example, if I were to set the first one to a C major chord, this is fine, no quantization needed for this. But if the root note of my second chord were a, what I would want is a minor chord, but a minor chord does have a minor third in it and not a major one. But because this C sharp, this would lead to, is not in a key of C major, and it gets corrected downwards, it should give me a C. So let's have a listen. Perfect. For easy chord progressions, let's go F, which should be major, and D, which should be minor. So let's move on to the LFO section now. The LFOs look pretty much the same as they do in the audio section. There's 3 LFOs with speed controls and depth controls, and by double tapping the LFO button you get into the MIDI LFO setup menu. Here also this looks the same as in the audio section. Here you can select a wave shape. You can set the speed down here, and you can coarsely adjust the speed by multiplying whatever you dialed in down here up here with this multiplier setting. Then you have a selection of different trig behaviors and a depth setting. The only thing that's really different from the audio LFOs is the destinations. Here you've got everything available that's in those MIDI menus. So for example, everything we've covered so far, note, velocity, length, note, 2, 3, 4, and so on. The ARP stuff, and then the LFOs themselves, speed 1, 2, 3, depth 1, 2, 3, even though I don't know what speed 1 should be good for. Even if you wanted LFO 1 to modulate itself, there wouldn't be a slot for a different destination available. So if you know what this is for, please let me know. And then we've got all the control parameters, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. Control 1 and control 2, where you can assign a bunch of CC values. But let's go back to the MIDI destinations real quick first, and maybe let's just use the note parameter to quickly demonstrate what this does. I have the destination set to note, the wave to a triangle wave. And this makes the notes go up and down and up and down. And this is also affected by the quantization setting in the ARP menu. As you probably could tell if I were to turn this off. Sounds like this. Yeah, speed, multiplier, and then maybe very quickly about the trig settings. Free means the LFO is just free running. Trig means it gets triggered by each trigger. And there's hold. This means whenever there's a trigger, the value where the LFO is at is going to be held until the next trigger. There's one, which triggers the LFO just once, and when it has reached the end of its shape, it's not going to do anything anymore. And then there's trig half, which is going to trigger only half of the shape, which can be useful because you're going to get unipolar LFO shapes. For example, here in this triangle, this would be only the positive part of the wave shape. And then there's sync trig, which will trigger the LFO in sync with the sequencer. So when the sequencer loops, it will also trigger the LFO. Then there's trig sync 1, which triggers the LFO at the start of the sequence and then just plays it once. And trig sync half, you can guess, it's going to trigger the LFO at the start of the sequence and then only play half of the LFO shape. And that's it. So let's move on to the control menus. Now let's have a look at control 1 first. Here we have PB, which stands for pitch bend, aftertouch, and 4 CC values. Right now it says off for all 6 of them. If you want to use them, you have to turn them on, and you do this by holding function and then pressing the corresponding encoder. So for pitch bend and coder A here, for example. And now instead of off, I get a number value here. And now I can send pitch bend information to the MicroFreak. Gonna get rid of those tricks again. As you can hear, this works. Then next there's aftertouch. Aftertouch can be useful because usually you can assign a lot of different stuff to aftertouch as a modulation source on a synth. That's how the MicroFreak does it as well. Here, this is this press modulation source. So I'm gonna turn on the aftertouch here on the Octatrack first, and then I'm just gonna assign some things to this press modulation source. For example, the wave sounds like this, and doing this does the same thing. And like I said, you can assign multiple things to this press source here. For example, the cutoff frequency of the filter also. Now, this noise you're hearing right now is because there's a conflict happening between this press parameter on the MicroFreak keyboard, which is sending information to the aftertouch, as well as the Octatrack. So it's kind of going back and forth between the two values. Whenever one of them changes, it's going to snap to that one. I can show you this maybe when I set this to hold. So there's nothing happening on the MicroFreak keyboard right now. And I can use the control on the Octatrack. There's a better way to fix this issue, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. But first, let me show you how you can assign CC values as well. I'm going to turn off the aftertouch here again, and then I'm going to assign a CC value to this CC1 parameter. I'm going to turn this on also, and then by double tapping the effects buttons, you get to the setup pages for the CCs, and here you can see what CC number is assigned to a CC1. Was 7 in this case, and I'm going to set this to 23 because that's the only one I know what it does. That's the filter cutoff frequency. And here also you can see this inversed text. Again, means you have to press yes or the encoder to confirm your selection. And now using this CC1 adjusts the filter. Now this works pretty smoothly because I'm not fiddling around with the filter knob here at the same time. If I were, you get that same stepping. So now that I have this CC number assigned, let's talk maybe about how we can use those. The sequencer is one option for this. You can lock CC values just like you would lock anything else to a trig to the trigs. Cool. Then you can use them as destinations for the LFO. So here I can choose control 1, CC1, and now I basically have an additional LFO for the microfreak modulating the filter. And then this might also be a good idea to talk about the different kinds of trigs that are available for the MIDI sequencer on the Octatrack. These red ones are just regular note trigs. They contain note information. And then you have the option to add log trigs. Those look like this, dimly green lit. They only contain parameter information. So I could lock the depth of this LFO. So when I decrease the depth in general here for this LFO, you can hear right here, it opens up. And that's the second type of triggers we have, and then there's a third one. When you have a regular note trig already in the sequencer and you hold function and press it again, it's going to light up bright green. And this means this guy does not contain a note, but it triggers the LFOs. Maybe set the LFO shape to something more envelope-like this guy, and the trig type to something that actually gets triggered by the trigs. You could hear just now the conflict between the CC and this guy. I could, for example, copy this guy and add a bunch of those. This will give me a rhythm structure, but without any actual note information. So if I were to get rid of these note trigs altogether, there's no sound, but what I could do is play the notes on the keyboard, and this is giving me the rhythm. Yeah. So that's the 3 different trig types that are available. Now I said I was going to tell you how you can fix the conflicts between the controls on the microfreak and on the Octatrack. You do this by setting up an additional MIDI connection going from the MIDI out of your external synth to the MIDI in of the Octatrack. Now next I'm gonna check, make sure that I have MIDI through off here, just to avoid running into unwanted MIDI loop issues. And then also in the MIDI menu here, I'm going to go to local and turn this off as well. What this does is it just disables the controls of those knobs for the Microfreak. But now, since we have this connected to the Octatrack and then it's going through the Octatrack and back into the Microfreak, this is still going to work. And the advantage of this is when I turn this knob now, it's going to turn over here as well. So both of those are always going to be in sync. As you can see on the screen here, also it works both ways. When I change the setting over here, it changes here as well. So that's pretty neat. I can use both of them at the same time and it's always clear what's happening. Also, you can see here that the LFOs are also running when the sequencer is not playing. You can see here, that's the this exponential shaped LFO1 here, which right now keeps looping because there's no more triggers. If I were to add some again, and you can also see here what it does. So yeah. Another thing where this comes in really helpful is when setting up CCs, because like I said, the filter is really the only one I know by heart. So if I wanted to assign some other parameter to those CCs, what I could do, instead of looking up the CC number and then manually dialing it in, I can, in the setup menu, hold function and then press the encoder. And then it tells you here that you're in the MIDI CC Learn mode. And now you can just turn a knob on the synth, for example, this shape here. And then it has automatically assigned the correct CC number to this without me having to look it up. And now if I wanted to use this, I have to turn it on. Again, hold function, press the encoder. So that's a very quick way of assigning CCs. So I'm gonna maybe do the timbre one here on the second one, and then on the third one, while I'm here, I'm gonna do decay. Turn this guy on as well. Cool. You can use them for parameter locks or as destinations for LFOs, which just comes with a whole lot of possibilities. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention here. When you do this, you connect the MIDI out of your synth to the input of the Octatrack. Be aware of the audio tracks also using incoming MIDI. So in the MIDI menu, there's this channel setting, and you can see here I turned off this channel 6. If the channel 6 was on and receiving incoming MIDI, the MIDI notes and CC values that I'm sending to the Octatrack might do weird stuff with audio track 6. So that's one way to avoid that, by just turning this channel off. Of course, I could also just use a channel that's not being used by the audio tracks. By default, they're set to 1 to A, so I could just use 9 to 16 for the MIDI tracks. That's all there is to say about this control 1 menu. Control 2 just gives you an additional 6 CC numbers. Maybe one quick remark about some of the labels under the CC numbers here. For some of them, it tells you what they're supposed to do. Like 10, for example, is supposed to be pan, but that doesn't have to be the case. So just make sure you've got the right number. On the Microfreak here, for example, I think 10 is one of these guys. This is 12. So yeah, wave would be CC10. So this is now controlling the wave and definitely not the panning. I mean, it's a mono instrument. There won't be any panning. So I've got everything covered in the menu pages here now, but there's still a couple more things I want to talk about. I did show you how to enter tricks in step recording mode, but you can also live record tricks, especially now since we have a instrument sending MIDI to the Octatrack. To live record, hold the record button and then push the play button. And it has now recorded the notes I played. Because of the note 2 and 3 settings here, it's also turning those into chords. And not only can you record notes, you can now also record CC values by moving the knobs on your synth while you're recording. So you can see it has now added on those steps where there's a no note trigger, some of these lock tricks where there's a CC value locked to the trig. For you to be able to record the CC values, you have to turn them on in the CC menus first. So for example, if I wanted to record the resonance here, that will not work until I assign a CC to the resonance. So one more time, holding function, pressing the encoder, turning the knob you want, and then if you haven't done so already, turn it on in the main effects page. And now I can also record the resonance movement. The resolution is restricted to the number of steps you have in the sequencer, so one new CC value per step, and there's no smooth transitions. If you want more smooth transitions, find a way to do it with the LFOs because they offer smoother shapes. We also have the option to add swing to the trigs. For this, go to the trig edit menu by holding function and then pressing bank, and then choose swing here, and now we have a swing option on a per track basis with values from 50 to 80. Let's have a listen to this. What this does is it just delays those steps that are green right now, which in this case leads to just regular swung 16ths. But by turning more of those on, you can come up with your own crazy rhythms. If you want different offsets for each note, there's a different way of doing this. You hold any trig you want to move to the left or right, and then you move it to the left or right by pressing the left or right arrow here. Pushing the left or right arrow here while holding down a trig also brings you to the trig conditions. Here you can select by turning the level encoder between different conditions for the trigger to happen or not. The options are fill, pre, neighbor, first, and then present, and those ratios, second of 3 times or fourth of 4, or which I think is a very cool feature for random stuff. So let me quickly get rid of all of these and then just make a short sequence. Yeah, just 2 steps, why not? And then add a couple of trigs and give both a probability of like 25%, why not? Here also 25%. So there's pretty much no telling when there is going to be a trig and when not. And combine this, for example, with a sample and hold LFO on the note value. And we're already in a pretty experimental territory, which I like. That's micro timing and conditions. One important thing to mention is that you can also use, of course, multiple tracks using the same MIDI channel. For example, here I've got those 2 tracks both set to 6, so I could add one sequence. Oh, this is short now. So I could, for example, on this track 1, have one sequence, and on track 2, a second one with maybe some higher notes, or just going to use the transpose function here. 2 octaves higher. There we go. Add some movement to this. And the neat thing about this is when you have them on separate MIDI tracks, well, one thing that allows you to do is to have just more than 4 notes. And the other thing it allows you to do is easily bring in parts and mute parts that are being sent to the same synthesizer. But yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. For this video, I think I've got everything covered that I wanted to. And all that's left for me to say is thanks a lot for being here. I hope you found this helpful or useful, and bye-bye.